Hello, my name is John Ford, and welcome to my Proxmox Automated Environment Provisioning course series. In this video, we're going to discuss the different options that you have for user authentication. So if you, as an instructor or as a manager, would like to have a predefined set of users that can then log in and spin up a copy of their environment, you'll set up the configuration one way, versus if you want to have a registration page where users can go in and register themselves, you set it up a different way. In this video, we're going to talk about all of that, including how to manage your users in Proxmox. The first decision that you have to make as an instructor is, how do you plan on authenticating your students to Proxmox? How do you plan on distributing their usernames and their passwords? Now, to do that, I have three approaches that all integrate very easily with these Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, and it is up to you as the instructor to choose which one best fits your needs. You can see the different sections in the description of this video. After I explain these three approaches, feel free to skip to the section that discusses how to actually implement that approach. The first approach is to provide each of your students with random passwords. This is illustrated here. What you would do is you would initially create a list of usernames. Then you would run a command that provisions users for each of these usernames. It will also assign them a randomly generated password that's 10 characters long and store that in the same file. From there, you'd have to distribute each student's username and password to that student. There are some disadvantages and advantages to this method. The advantages is it's probably by far the most secure. Each student gets their own unique username and password combination. However, the disadvantage is, as the instructor, you have to contact each individual student and provide them with their username and their password. That might not be feasible for a classroom of 30 students or for a lecture hall with 50 students or more. The second approach you can take is, instead of generating random passwords for each of the users, we provide them with a default password, such as change me, for example. Then each user will initially be created with the default password of change me. However, upon first logging in, the users will be requested to change their password. So then from there, they can go ahead and then choose whatever password they would like to use. The advantage to this is you don't have to distribute username and password credentials to each individual student. You can simply tell them or send one generic message and say, the login is your first letter of your first name and your last name, and then the password is change me, and you will be requested to change your password upon initially logging in. Again, the advantage to this is you don't have to distribute the passwords to each of the users. The perhaps disadvantage is it is a little bit less secure in that each student knows that the password for other students is also change me, so they could potentially log on as one of the other students if they could guess their username and change another student's password, thus denying them access. All right, the third approach we have here is, let's say you don't know what users are going to show up. For example, let's say you're doing a one-time conference, or let's say you're kind of lazy. You don't want to put together a list of usernames of all the users that are going to be attending your class or all the students that are going to be in your class. Instead, you want to allow users to sign up themselves, right? To do that, you would provide an instructor-provided access code. This access code provided to each of the students who want to use your service will allow them to go ahead and choose their own unique username and choose their own password and create an account that way. The advantage to this is It's probably the laziest approach. You don't have to distribute any credentials to any of the users. All you simply say is, here's the access code, go register for yourself. However, the disadvantage is that anybody with this access code can then go ahead and create a user. This might not be something you want for, let's say, a traditional classroom setting. You don't want a student, for example, sharing the access code with somebody else who isn't taking the class and having them register to create their own environment and waste space on your server when they're not actually one of your students. However, for, like I mentioned earlier, for a public workshop where you don't know who's going to show up, this is a much easier method where you can provide everybody with an access code and let them get themselves registered. All right, now I am going to show the first authentication option that we discussed, where each of the students is provided with a randomly generated password. I am looking at my Proxmox and pfSense remote management machine. This is the machine that also has the web service that students will be able to access and start their environments from. In my case, I have it on Proxmox itself as a manager machine here. If you follow this tutorial series, I will show you how to set it up that way. However, I would like to note that you could also have this as a separate machine entirely. For example, if you have a separate server that you wanted to have as your dedicated web server, this could be on that as well. But in my case, it just happens to be in Proxmox itself. Here, I am in the etc Proxmox directory that I have created. When I went through the installation process, it created this config.ini file for me. The config.ini file is what you will use to perform all your configuration as the instructor and make sure that the web interface acts the way you'd want it to act. Of course, if you were following along in this series, you already understand how the config.ini file works and what sorts of configurability it provides. In addition to that, I created a usernames.txt file where I simply entered the usernames for the users that I would like to have present in Proxmox. So that's J. Doe, R. Smith, M. Johnson, and D. Jones. In addition, I added an instructor user that I, as the instructor, will use to access this environment. And I want the instructor user to have a different password from the rest of the users that is perhaps not randomly generated. In order to do that, in the file itself, I have specified my password, which in this case is capital P password 123 exclamation point, separated by a comma, right? If I did not specify a password here, the instructor's password would be randomly generated just like the rest of the users. If there was another user that for some reason I didn't want to randomly generate their password, but I wanted to actually specify the password for, I could do the same thing where I put a comma and the password I would like that user to have. The first thing I'm going to do is move that usernames.txt file to a new file that I'm going to call creds.csv. The reason I'm doing this is because I like to keep these two files separate. Creds.csv will hold all of the username and password, the full credentials for each of the users, and it will be dynamically updated as the users change their passwords if they decide to do so. However, the usernames.txt will just contain the usernames as I showed you before. Anyway, in order to do this, because I'm working in a write-protected directory, I'm going to have to do a few different things. The first thing I'm going to do is, as sudo, as the super user, I'm going to create a file called creds.csv with the touch command. Now if I list out the files in this directory, you see that creds.csv has been created. The second thing I would like to do is change the permissions on this creds.csv file that I created so that I can write to it. I also want it to be readable and writable by the web user. The web user needs to be able to write to this file in order to write any password changes to the file. In order to do this, I'm going to do sudo chown to change the ownership of the file, I'll make my user manager the owner of the file so that I can make changes to it. I will make www data, or the group that the web user belongs to. I'll make that the group that owns the file so that then I can assign special permissions to that group. And then I'll say creds.csv. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say sudo chmod 6664 creds.csv. What that did is it provided read and write privileges to me, manager, as the owner of the file. It provided read and write privileges to the web user, www data, as the group owner of the file, and it provided only read privileges to everybody else. If you're worried about having other users on your machine and you don't want them to be able to read the file, you can always change this to 660, and then nobody else would be able to even read the file. I'll do this just as an example. Now, if I print out again the files in this directory, but this time I append -lah so that I can see the permissions of each of these files as well, you'll notice that for creds.csv, manager has read-write access to it. The web user, www data, has read-write access to it, and no other users have read or write access to it. Now that this is set up, I can safely copy over usernames.txt into creds.csv. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to print out usernames.txt, and I'm going to redirect it to creds.csv. And now if I print out the contents of creds.csv with cat, you'll notice it has all those new users that I copied over. You might not have to go through all this work to do that if you are working in a different directory where you have privileges to write to. Just do note that the web user has to have privileges to write to this creds.csv file for this to work. All right. Now that that's over and done with, I'm going to create all these users in Proxmox and assign them random passwords. I can do this very simply by using the puser or Proxmox user command. If I do puser-h to print out the help screen, you'll notice it mentions all of the options. So we can, in this case, we want to create users, so we'll specify create. We'll use that creds.csv as our users file. Notice it says path to file containing users, with each user on a separate line with format either username or the username, password, which is exactly what we have. By default, it will generate random passwords for each of these users and update the file accordingly. So if I do puser create -f for the file and I specify creds.csv, you'll notice it created each of the users in turn. It generated a random password for that user, and in addition, it updated the creds.csv file with the random passwords it generated. Now if I print out that creds.csv file, you'll notice that it has all of the users, but this time with passwords after the comma. Now you would be able to reach out to your students and provide them with their respective username and password combination. You'll notice that the instructor password also stayed the same. It stayed capital P password 123 exclamation point. Again, because I specified that password beforehand, it did not randomly generate one for me. The last thing I'm going to do is edit that config.ini file that also exists within the same directory. You can, of course, edit this file with any editor that you would like, but I personally prefer using the Nano editor, and so I am going to edit it with Nano. I can simply edit it by saying nano config.ini. From here, we'll have to specify our desired configuration within the user section of this configuration file. First of all, we do not want users to be able to register themselves because we are distributing all our credentials to our students. Therefore, I can set register to false. This will disable the registration page, so users will only be able to log in, not create new users. Because we only want users to be able to log in, and we don't want that registration page, we don't need to provide an access code for that registration page. Therefore, I will comment this line out by preceding it with a semicolon. If I forget to comment this line out, that's no big deal anyway. As long as register is set to false, students will not be able to create new Proxmox users. Similar to with this access code option, we can go ahead and comment out the registrant groups option. This option simply assigns a group to users upon registration, but because we don't want them to be able to register, again, we can comment this option out. And last but not least, we'll comment out the option change password. This option forces users with the provided password to change their password on logging in. This is useful for the default password option, which I'll showcase later. But in our case, we want students to be able to choose any password they would like, as long as it fits within password complexity requirements. And we've already generated some random passwords for them, so we do not need them to change their password upon logging in. The last thing to make sure is that this creds file option points to the creds file that we just created. In my case, I placed that creds file in /etc/proxmox/creds.csv, so this looks correct. If I had that creds file in a different location, or if I gave it a name other than creds.csv, I would change that here. I also have to make sure that that option is uncommented or that it is not preceded by a semicolon. Once these changes have been made, I can hit Ctrl-O to write changes to the file and Ctrl-X to exit. Once I have done this, Proxmox has been set up and fully configured for use by the users that I provided. As an example, I am now going to log into one of those users that I have just created. You'll notice that when I visit the login page, because I set that register option to false, there is no option to register a new user. Even if students visited the registration page, which is at register.php, they will simply be redirected back to the login page. I will now try logging in as user jdoe, using the randomly generated password that we have generated previously. Printing out the contents of creds.csv, I see that jdoe's password is this. I have already gone ahead and copied this password to my clipboard so that I can then paste it on the login screen here and click Login. You'll notice I was successfully able to log in as user jdoe, and from here I can start my environment and access it as user jdoe. When finished, I can sign back out. Once all your students have finished their work, you may very easily destroy all of the user accounts you previously created. In order to do this, you can again use the puser command. If I say puser and destroy, and then provide that creds file again with the -f option, so I will say -f creds.csv. Running this command removes all the Proxmox users that I had previously created. If, instead of randomly generating passwords, I wanted to assign all students a default password that they are then required to go in and change, the process for setting this up looks very similar as for what I mentioned previously, which was generating random passwords. Any differences between these two I will now illustrate. Again, I have gone ahead and created that creds.csv file, just like I did before, and given read and write privileges to both me as the manager user and also to the web user www.data. I have also gone ahead and copied over the content from usernames.txt to creds.csv. You can see that content if I print out the contents of creds.csv. You'll notice that again, all of the users that I want to assign the default password, I have just written the username itself and I have not provided a password. However, for any users that I want to provide a specific custom password rather than the default password, I have specified that password here after the comma. From here, I can again run the puser command. puser create and specify that creds.csv file. However, before we ran this command, just as you see here, and it generated random passwords for each of these users. If instead I wanted to if I wanted to use a default password for each of these users, I can specify that password with the -p option. I will simply say -p, and then I'll set the password to change me. Running this command, it seems to have created each of these users. It has also updated the creds.csv file accordingly. If I now print out the contents of the creds.csv file, you'll notice that each of the users for which I did not explicitly specify a password, their password has been set to change me. Similarly to when I assigned each user a random password, we will also have to make a few configuration changes in the config.ini file. I will show those configuration changes here. Just like before, we want to set register to false. This is because we are explicitly specifying all of the usernames that we would like to have access to Proxmox. We do not want students to go on and register new users. Therefore, we will disable the registration page by setting register to false. Similarly, we do not need to provide an instructor access code, and we do not need to provide registrant groups. However, this time we will uncomment the change password option. This will force any users with this default password to change their password once they log in. In this case, the password change me is in fact the default password that I have set for these users. If I set a different default password, I would change it to reflect that default password here. Just like before, we also have to make sure that the creds file is in fact pointing to the location of creds.csv on my management machine. This is, in fact, the correct location for creds.csv. With these changes, I can go ahead and save this config.ini file. Now I will demonstrate what it looks like to log in as a student with this authentication option, and I will do this by logging in as user jdoe. I can provide jdoe as the username, and for the password, I will provide change me, which is the default password that the instructor created. Logging in, you'll notice I am immediately taken to the change password page where I'm asked to provide a new password. From here, I can change my password to a new secure password. Once I have changed my password, I can then go ahead and start, access, or stop my environment as user jdoe. When user jdoe is finished with everything they need to do, they can then go ahead and sign out. The next time that user logs in, they will be able to log in with the new password that they specified when they were changing their password. Just as with the first option we discussed, where users were assigned randomly generated passwords, all users are deleted in the same manner. I can simply use a puser command saying destroy and specify the credentials file creds.csv. This will go ahead and remove all of the Proxmox users. Last but not least, I'll show the third authentication option, in which users register themselves. You'll notice this time in my Proxmox configuration directory, the only file I have is config.ini. This is the configuration file that's read by the web interface. However, I do not have a credentials file or a file specifying usernames and passwords. One thing I would like to do is I would like to create a credentials file that will be empty. The reason I'm going to do this is so that then later, when users do come in and sign up, their credentials will be added to this creds file. This will make it very easy for me as an instructor to read that creds file and see what users have signed up. In order to do this, I'm going to say sudo touch creds.csv. Sudo to run this as the super user, because by default, the manager user that I'm running as doesn't have access to this directory. Therefore, I'm running as the super user with sudo. I'm using the touch command to create a new file, and the file I'm creating is creds.csv. Once I run this, if I again list out the contents of this directory with ls, you'll notice now we also have that creds.csv file. However, in order for that creds.csv file to be written to by the web user needs to have write access to that creds.csv file. In order to do this, I will use sudo chown and www.data creds.csv. This will set the user owner to the web user and the group owner also to the web user. If I now print out this directory, you can see that the creds.csv file is owned by the www.data user and by the www.data group. You'll also notice that the www.data user by default does already have write permissions to the creds.csv file. If this wasn't the case, I could always change the permissions with chmod. For example, if I did sudo chmod and I changed the permissions to 664, this would provide the www.data user with read and write permissions. It would provide the www.data group also with read and write permissions. And it would provide anybody who isn't part of this user, or who isn't this user or part of this group, with only read permissions to this file. I would also like to note that if you are following along with previous parts of the video and you used the commands that I previously used to make manager the owner of the file and www.data or the web user the group owner of the file, those would also work here. So the permissions are kind of up to you. In this case, the manager does not directly need to access or write to the creds file, and for that reason, I decided not to make them the owner of the file. However, this is up to you, as long as you make sure that the web user has right access to this creds.csv file. After having created this file, there are a couple additional changes we are going to have to make to the config.ini file. Editing the config.ini file, the first change I would like to make is to set register to true. This will create the registration page that users can then utilize to register and create their respective accounts. In addition to that, I will set the access code by uncommenting this line. That is just removing the preceding semicolon and setting the access code to what I would like to set it to. In this case, to keep it simple, I'll make the access code with a capital A and a capital C and no space in between. Make sure that when you do this, your access code is enclosed in these single quotes. The second thing I'm going to set is this registrant groups. This registrant groups defines what Proxmox groups to add new users to. For example, looking at my data center and heading over to groups, you can see I have created this seminar group. The name of this group is Seminar, and the comment says users for this seminar series. By providing the name Seminar, I can automatically add any new users that are created through the registration page to this group. Because I want to add any new users that are created to the seminar group, I will leave this as it is. Last but not least, I do not want to force users to change their passwords, and for this reason I will comment out the change password option by preceding it with a semicolon. I will also make sure that this creds file option points to the creds file that I have previously created. The creds file I have previously created is located in etc proxmox creds.csv, so this looks okay. But if it was located elsewhere, I would change this option to reflect that. When finished, I can save and exit this file. Here's what this would look like from the student's perspective. You'll notice that this time, when we access the login screen, we have an additional option here that says don't have an account, sign up now. Clicking on sign up now redirects us to the registration page. From here, as an example, I will register as user JDoe. I will say JDoe as my username, and for my password, I'll simply make it capital P, password 123 exclamation point. Once again, the access code will be the access code that we previously defined in the configuration file. In this case, it's access code with a capital A and a capital C and no space. As a note, if the username already exists in Proxmox, rather than registering this new user, it will provide an error that the username is already taken. This is to avoid creating duplicate users. In any case, now that I've entered this information, I can click Submit to create my user. From here, I can log in as JDoe with the password that I have previously provided. And after having logged in, I can start, access, and stop my environment accordingly. When finished, I can sign out. If we specified a creds file, like we did previously within our config.ini configuration file, all new user creation and password changes will be reflected in that creds file. What does this mean? This means that whenever students create new users, for example, like we just did, we created the user jdoe, that username and password was then logged in the creds.csv file. So if I now print out the contents of the creds.csv file, you'll notice that we have a new entry with jdoe and the password that we specified, which was capital P password 123 exclamation point. If jdoe were to then go in and change their password, this would also be updated here. Having this creds.csv file makes it very easy to remove all users that were created. I can simply do this, as we did in previous examples, with the puser command. I will say puser destroy -f to provide a credentials file and creds.csv. This has gone ahead and destroyed all of the users that were in the credentials file. This means that any users that register on the registration page, once your seminar or your one-time workshop has been completed, they can be very easily deleted with this puser command. In addition, you can see what users have been created along with their passwords in this creds.csv file, which is updated as users are created. This concludes showing how to use the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts and web application from the instructor's perspective. In summary, we have gone over 3 different authentication options that the instructor has at their disposal, and we have seen how to set up the scripts so that they work with each of these authentication options. We have also seen what authentication would look like from a student's perspective with each of these options.